Good evening. It's absolutely a pleasure for us to really have Bob Eberhart or Robert Eberhart with us today for the Thinkers Dialog. I know he's joining from on a very different time zone. He's joining in from Stanford, and it's 6 a.m. in the morning. And I have to be apologetic and thankful at the same time for really taking out time at this time of the day. So, Bob, really big thanks for this. But I must introduce you, Bob, introduce all of you on the platform today to who Bob is. Robert is somebody who directs research at Stanford University's Graduate School of Business, where he studies entrepreneurship and how it shapes society. He's earned his PhD from Stanford itself. He's actually working in areas like theoretical constructs on how institutional changes has complex effects on new firms and how entrepreneurship is changing society. In fact, I think his ideas are very, very compelling and very different points of view in terms of like how we really look at things. In fact, the number of accolades that he has received are probably countless. When I was looking at his CV, there are tons and tons of them, but I should just share a couple of them. In fact, he's won awards for responsible research in business and management. He has got the best paper or theory paper award, outstanding scholar award, et al. And then, of course, before he became an academic, he was somebody who has worked with the government because he was a vice chairperson of the U.S. Department of State and Métis Japan-U.S. Innovation and Entrepreneurship Council. And then, of course, he has also worn a very interesting hat, and that is an entrepreneurship hat. So when I was actually looking at his profile, and he's an entrepreneur, and what he's writing is something so very interesting. So probably at some point in time, he's also hitting at his brethren, if I might actually want to say that. And then, of course, Bob started two very interesting initial or enterprises. One is Wine and Style, wherein he was selling wine, or he was distributing Californian wines to Japanese and other Asian markets. And before that, he was executive at semiconductor and electronic hardware company. And then, of course, the most interesting thing, and one thing that we have in common, and that is that he's a pilot and an amateur astronomer. So, Bob, I used to fly at some point in time till the time I gained so much weight that I was not able to do that. So, but that was good 30 years back when I was flying Cessnas, and I learned to fly on a Cessna. But now I'm trying to get trim again and get back to flying. So I hope I'll get motivated with your thing. And then he's an amateur astronomer. That's something very interesting. 3 kids, and his wife's a dentist. So, Bob, thanks a lot for joining us today. It's absolutely a pleasure.
Thanks. It's a distinct honor to be here. Thank you for inviting me, even at this hour, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you, Bob. So, Bob, we'll dive into the conversation and your remarks. Like, in fact, the title of your paper is "Freedom is just another word for nothing left to lose." And that's a very interesting point of view. In fact, I would like to start with one of the most interesting things that you talk about. That there is something called as Proposition 22, and that's the central theme from where you're actually coming from. What is this Proposition 22, and how do you really see it having an impact on the wider world that we are really looking at?
Thank you very much for that question. And I think you're right. That is a central construct of the whole study. Um, Proposition 22 was a initiative in California for the voters to approve. It was sponsored by the transportation app companies, or at least supported by them. And what its provisions were to it was a response to California requiring transportation app companies to treat their employees, their drivers, if you will, as employees. With employees, they would get things like vacation, overtime benefits, and certain protections that are in California law to protect employees. This proposition said that companies do not need to treat them as employees, but could treat them as independent contractors. As independent contractors, then, they do not gain vacations, have rights about hiring and firing, do not have benefits like health benefits, or are really not required to. And and it changes the relationship between the worker, the driver in this case, and the company, the app in this case, uh, in how they will work together and decide to work together. And what happens is by suspending protections in law for a minimum wage, for example, and other legal requirements that we have to do with employees, the companies gain two things. One, they certainly are gaining benefits in terms of the cost they pay. If they had to pay the drivers minimum wage just for times for being there, it would cut into the profits. And then the second thing is that the employees, these independent contractors, engage in a race to the bottom. So you've had declining shares of revenue to them, declining rates of pay. Now, the counter to that, of course, is that they're giving a lot of freedom. They can engage with the company the way they want. They can work when they want. People can go and set their schedules and take other jobs, for example, and become, sort of a gig worker entrepreneur. The problem is there's no guarantees in that. And so what we title of the claim, freedom is another word for nothing less to lose. Sure, you have all this freedom, but basically you're out there on your own. And what's happened is that the responsibility for your continued employment and stability of your work situation has been shifted from the company. When we used to think about, General Motors would pay employees and be responsible for employing them and be news if they had to lay people off, to the employee who's now responsible for taking care of her own career, her own income, paying her own health insurance, and they become in the bright side, people call them entrepreneurs. On the other side, the people call them exploited workers. Now, we're not going to make either of those normative claims, but what we found interesting and what generated the study was that it was no surprise the app company supported this. I mean, it's in somewhat their economic interest. What's surprising is that some of the more, we would think, liberal causes supported it also. But interestingly, a big amount, we're not sure how much, but a big amount of the app drivers themselves supported it. So the study is, how do people come to accept that they're responsible for their own wages, their own work? How did that get transferred from the company to the person? And what are the probable effects?
Yep. So, but Bob, before we get into your study, there's a very startling thing or a data point that comes on the first page itself of your idea, that there was close to about $200 million that were spent by the app companies. I'm not really saying that why did they spend $200 million, but it leads us to a larger issue of how capitalism functions and what is the kind of connivance that can actually happen between the regulator, or what you would call as a politician here, and then, of course, the capitalistic system, or what you would call as an enterprise here.
Right. That's a fascinating question. That really is. And a big point here. Yes, $200 million to support a law in order to deprive others. And of course, in their view, it was providing others freedom, but to deprive them of the benefits of employment is a fascinating, for two reasons. One, just the amount of effort that was put into it and the importance that obviously expressed. But it's an expression we see happening around this whole app thing. For example, one of the reasons that some of these transportation companies could succeed is that they simply ignored the laws that regulated taxis in various cities. They just said, okay, so you, the taxi company, have to get a license, have to get a badge, have to have a certain license structure for your drivers, and that's the way you have to operate. And, an app comes along, and many of the regulatory agencies just look the other way and says, well, that's innovation, so that we got to let that happen. And, of course, that meant a very uneven competition field. Now, it's kind of hard to be angry about that in transportation, since Uber provided a much better service, as it turns out. But and certainly competed on that basis. But we have to be aware that things are changing. I don't think General Motors could have gotten away with putting out a beta version of AutoDrive in 1975 and survived the regulatory scrutiny would have come over. Other companies do that now, almost with impunity, and almost look at the government to dare them. Of course, the government's responding a little bit, but it's definitely changed, in my view, to where we favor the aspirations of companies because they label themselves entrepreneurial and innovative. And we pay less attention to the rest of us who have to work for and around these companies.
So I'll come back to this point later in our conversation because I have many things that I need to ask here. But then, like you said something very interesting again, that 60% of the people possibly are app-based drivers favored the proposition 22. Uh, that's a very startling number because they're suddenly giving away so much. Because if
Mhm.
this proposition was in their favor, they would have actually got regular salaries, much more protection, holidays, or guarantees in terms of benefits that you're getting. And suddenly they're actually doing away with it. What is driving this thinking? Because this is so fascinating in terms of like how this is really happening. Because it is effectively saying that you're trying to stand on a thin piece of ice and probably get drowned.
I think that's exactly right, the way to look at it. And that's why we talk about the shift of the responsibility to stay employed moves from the company to the employee nowadays. And what's driving it, and that's what we identify in the paper, is this ideology, not the actual fact, but the ideology that entrepreneurship is always good and provides the greatest amount of benefit. So, in other words, when I label them as entrepreneurs, well, then, yeah, the good ones will make a lot of money and they'll be fine. And, the bad ones will failure. They'll tell you failure is part of entrepreneurship. And so, of course, there's going to be some failures because that's part of entrepreneurship. Well, the problem is we're talking about people's work and eating. And there's great research on this done by a very prominent scholar named Juliet Shore, who looks at the outcomes of gig workers and finds that, broadly speaking, the people that do this kind of gig work for a second job or to supplement their income, that kind of thing, they meet their aspirations. They do okay. But those who try to make a living at it do very, very poorly. And the the problem is that as we change jobs into this or the working, we basically deprive people of other things they can do um, in society. And there's an ad that came out in American television for one of the app companies that was just fascinating. It showed a person um, ending his regular job and preparing dinner or playing with his kids or something. Then it advertises, look what you can do in your spare time. You don't have to do that. You can drive for Uber. And that's, to me, was the most fascinating, revealing ad I've ever seen, because I would think that the core of life, and I have 3 children, is being done with work and seeing my children and going to going to meetings in uh, my local government, or reading, or playing with my wife, just whatever. And it's surprising that it shifts. What's happened is my responsibility to find work, and then it becomes a 24-hour job. When you're working and not sure you're going to have a job in a week because you're the one that has to find the work, it's hard to take a vacation. It's hard to, because you're not paying yourself during that time. And that's, some people like that, and that's fine. But it's surprised how it's getting redefined as appropriate for everyone else. And the reason is, and I want to answer your question directly, at least what we're proposing, is that the act of entrepreneurship, which, as you pointed out in your very kind introduction, I was, which is organizing an activity in order to create a commercial end and a profit, has been transformed into this global idea, I think, by joining with the ideas of neoliberalism, the ideas of individual effort, and you have to take care of yourself, and you shouldn't rely on government for work and everything else. I think it's combined with that and made this idea that we should all be responsible for ourselves and we should all be um, just agents out there, and some of us succeed and some of us fail. This is really important. We see this in meetings all the time right now. For example, oh gosh, most of us have been in meetings where the boss in front of us, she says that, we all need to be entrepreneurial around here. And that doesn't mean you should all go and start companies. It does mean that your budget has been cut and you're more likely to be fired. And, so you have to really work, to find your own resources. And that's interesting. We've taken this occupational concept, entrepreneurship, which when I was in college was an occupation. It was fine. Some people did it, and made and elevated it to the point where we now say everyone should act that way. And so that comes with beliefs. One, that I ought to support laws that freed the government regulatory structure because those are bindings on entrepreneurship. And then it does the second thing, and I think the most pernicious to my view, is that it tells people part of entrepreneurship is you have to fail because most entrepreneurs fail, and entrepreneurship means failure. And the truth of the matter is what that is it's telling people to look at their own lives, I think, and if they can see a string of failures and think they're on the right path. So in other words, it creates sort of a social lubricant that damps down protest, if you will, and that's one of the reasons you get, I think, such support. There's such a belief in entrepreneurship. There's such a belief that I can be as wealthy as some of these famous entrepreneurs if I just apply myself and willing to take risk. And generally speaking, that's not true, and we end up with people with insecure lives. And the consequence, of course, is some political instability. And we've seen this in countries, not just the United States.
Oh, yes, absolutely. But then just pushing forward this point, like you write and you quote Taubiana 20 from his paper in 2020. But I have I think if you would like to answer this question, please do. Otherwise, we can just skip it. But I would still want to ask this question. You write, unexpected and surprising social realms, such as sex workers, people adopt the language of entrepreneurship as a symbol of legitimacy and a justification for new employment relationships. My question here is that, like when we start justifying these kind of this thing, I'm not saying that somebody who's doing it is wrong or ethically or morally wrong, but the question is, it hides the exploitation that can actually happen. It can hide the very element of trafficking that can actually happen because you're just trying to push that under the carpet.
Exactly right. And I don't think it's so much trying to push it under the carpet. I think it's actually just it's an idea that works. And let me explain it with a metaphor, if you don't mind. Just take a minute here. In around the turn from the 19th to the 20th century, coal mines in Pennsylvania, and I know this well because my grandparents worked in them. The coal mines would hire people this way. You would show up in the morning at 6 a.m. or something with picks and shovels and other instruments you needed to mine coal, and then they would open the doors and count the people until it was full, and then at the end of the day, you would bring your coal out in a cart. They would weigh it, and they would pay you for the weight. And there are songs in American folk songs, 16 hours and what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. And it's a reflection that you had to sometimes borrow the money to buy the tools. And then you'd work hard and you wouldn't get paid enough to pay for the tools. And in those days, we decided as collectively that was a bad way to organize work. And laws were passed, and there's a long history of government regulation of employment and labor union support that I won't go over. But we decided that was bad, and we needed to do something about it. Nowadays, app transportation companies hire the people in the same way. No difference at all. They have to buy their own tool, the car.
Yeah.
You know, they have to worry about if they're going to work hard enough to make money. What's interesting back in the old coal mining, if you were sick, you didn't work. If you were an immigrant, a new immigrant, and couldn't afford tools, you couldn't work. And we have it the same way, but nowadays we view that app as innovative and good. It's difference in our point of view, the way we see things, that's changed. We would see these labor practices in the past as exploitive, and something had to be done. Now we see these labor practices as innovative and entrepreneurial, and transforming us into a more entrepreneurial world, which is, kind of an imprecise thing to say. But I think that's what's happening. I think your point is exactly right. It's fascinating that so many voted for this. It's fascinating. I mean, there's some that like it, and that's fine. We understand that. But it's an interesting law. It has another feature. Part of the provisions is that it takes 7/8 of the vote, 7/8 of the vote to change it, which means it'll never be changed. We never vote on 7/8 of anything. And so it's fascinating how people think that without examining the law, just because they say it creates, entrepreneurs and confirms entrepreneurs, it becomes a good thing. So what's changed, and I'm glad you asked the question because it's the core of the paper. What's changed is the way we view our social outcomes, the way where we ought to be, where we ought to end up. I think we had in the past more of a view that everyone on average should do well. Be able to afford a house, send their children to college, all that stuff. I come from an immigrant family that, just send their children to college. But now, I'm not saying people don't want to send their children to college, but now we say, look, you're going to be responsible to figuring that thing out. The burden's on you. And so we've changed into this, almost society of people who are competing with each other. And there's no doubt this has something, in my mind, there's no doubt this has something to do with sort of the worry, concern that this precarious nature of employment is creating.
But Bob, just going deeper into this, like on the gig work, I do not know if you've been following India, but just to share an idea or a point here. In India, we had a very successful IPO recently for a company called Zomato, which was closely valued at about $15 to $20 billion and fairly successful IPO. And it is all about distributing or taking food to your homes from restaurants. And suddenly you look at that kind of valuation. Of course, in the times of pandemic, it did help a lot of people. But what is really happening? Because across the world, these kind of apps, or what you're calling as what people are seeing as innovative or value creating or wealth creating, actually have a detrimental impact in the long term. And there are many of them in India that are actually driving. Uber is there, you have Olas, you have Zomatos of the world, or you have Swiggies of the world. There are many of them. So what is driving all this? Because I think when you say that it's all about the way we are looking at things, it's the transformation that we have had in our thinking. But what has changed? What caused that transformation?
Thank you. That's a really good question. And I'm aware of at least some of these going on in India. And you see a lot of what I call extraction of value from mundane activity. So people delivering food to offices throughout India is an old system. I mean, that goes back to, I don't know how long that goes back. And it was just something that relatively disadvantaged people would do to earn income. Somebody organized that and turned it into an IPO. Well, that makes a few hundred people very wealthy, but it doesn't make everyone who's delivering food wealthy. It's just a way of extracting value out of it. But let me get to kind of your core question, which is most interesting, is what changed. And we describe it in the paper, and it's worth talking about it. And this is a U.S. centric view. We realize that's a flaw of this paper right now, but we're writing a book and talking about it at the countries. But in the we really had this idea in the United States and certainly in Japan that companies took care of employees, that there was long-term employees. When I worked for General Motors when I was a kid, paying my way through school, I remember there were 700,000 employees. They would give us videos, you're one of 700,000, and we'd all be proud. And we had large companies that employed a big chunk of the working population. Now, it wasn't all paradise, and there was, all kinds of problems with that. But at least we had because in large companies, pay compresses, and you don't have a few small companies with a few people making $1 billion in an IPO and everyone else not. You have, the difference between the boss and the worker tends to compress in large companies. And so we had a fairly egalitarian country in the United States. Our Gini coefficient was similar to Canada and Japan and that kind of thing. In the 1970s, you may recall that there was an oil crisis. There were international instabilities. And inflation and employment took off. I hate to make it personal again, but when I graduated college in 1982, the unemployment rate in Michigan was something like 15%, and the prime rate was pushing 20%. I mean, the inflation was out of control, unemployment was out of control. And that was a contradiction to the standard economic Keynesian analysis. The idea, at least in the popular view, was that those two things couldn't happen again. And so what policymakers did, there was a restive electorate here, was they turned to the views of the monetarists, fundamentally out of Chicago, who said that if we, control money, if we deregulate, if we take the government out of the equation, we're all going to do better. Things will become Pareto optimal if we let the market operate. And then for the next 2 decades, we tore apart the regulatory structure that created the large businesses in the United States. And so now General Motors has far less than 700,000 employees. And what hasn't been replaced by other companies employing that many people. It's been replaced by some companies here in Silicon Valley, which employ, 100,000 or something like that. But it's nothing like the conglomerates of the past. And we accept that because we've, for the past 30 years, just come to believe that market outcomes are good if we just let the market operate. And that changed. That was a radical idea, I think, in 1980. I mean, just in my view, that we should, it's the neoliberal idea. And that what's made that neoliberal idea embed and stay is this idea of connecting it with entrepreneurship. That, look, we believe that government shouldn't be here. We're individual actors. We are not part, we're going to de-emphasize the community. And so now it changed largely because of economic stresses in the past. It may change again because of economic stresses in the future. I'm not sure. I can't predict. But it really did change in the United States and in England and others in response to those disruptions and insecurities that were extant in the 1970s. I think we're creating insecurities now. We're creating political tensions that didn't exist in the United States 20 years ago. And I think that's a result, and it may change again, but certainly people's minds for a long time changed. And since the economy did well for, 15 years, during Clinton in particular. And so that's what's interesting. And to me, it just brings down to the point that we view the world very, very much differently. Um, when and again, I hate to make it personal again, but these thoughts are. I can remember being a young person, and every year I was amazed by the innovation. The cell phone came out, that was a thrill. The internet came out in 1985 or something like that. CDs came out, CD players, that was great, and beat the LPs. We were exploring different planets, that was really cool. Nowadays, we get excited on a new rev of an iPhone. And, the character of innovation seems very much different now and directed at private interests. When we saw a rocket go up in 1969, on the side of it, it said USA. It was a collective effort. We all celebrated and watched on TV. A rocket goes up now, it says SpaceX on the side, and one person's making a lot of money. So it's changed from this public community innovation and, and view of how the world is to this more private financial view. And it's, to me, fascinating that we celebrate entrepreneurs the way we do. I was an entrepreneur. I knew how to build my business, but I wasn't an expert on epidemiology. And we do that all the time now. We ask people's opinion because they're rich, rather than because they're experts. And so it's just a different world, and we're trying to explain it.
Mhm. And so, Bob, you make again something you share very interesting data, and I'll go back to the corporations and everything
Okay.
here, and inequality that you mentioned in your previous point. And it is that uh, typical worker compensation has risen only about 12%, while CEO compensation has grown by 940%.
Right.
That's huge. Uh,
It's huge.
and so if you really look at this, in fact, what we are really saying here is that it has caused so much of disparity. And I'm sure this disparity could also be the reason for anxiety that actually happens within the political systems across the board. Because as I understand and as I see it, the rise of authoritarianism, as you might actually call, or the rise of the populist leaders, or whatever, that is being driven by people who are not getting the equitable share in the way the world is actually growing. And there is that huge level of disenchantment. And corporations are effectively playing that itself.
Yes, I think that's precisely correct and a great question. We do, we are concerned by the spread of pay. One of the mechanisms that others have identified that we cite in the paper is that larger corporations tend to compress pay. The reason is that you have to have equity among people at the same level, or you create jealousies and work problems. The jump can't be so big, so you don't, up in pay, so that you don't create inappropriate and vicious competition to get those few jobs up above. And you're all living and working together, and there's norms that develop. But when you change the system to what we have now, where we believe that people deserve pay because they accept risk. It used to be we and there's lots of interesting data, but used to believe we thought people deserved a lot of pay because they were good organizers. They could really put this thing together. They can assemble this disparate group of companies or something, and they were just terrific organizers and they deserve some pay. Now we take this argument that they deserve pay because they took a risk, and you see a lot of, I started this company. I did it alone. I took risk, and so I deserve pay. And what's happening is these companies are smaller. A lot of the pay is in stock and stock options, so it's not stated salary. And you get to a situation now where I believe the average pay of a Fortune 500 company CEO is pushing $30 million. And don't hold me to that, but it's something like that. And the difference in pay between the highest and lowest is just immense. In other countries, you don't really see that as much. Where I worked in Japan, CEOs would rarely pay themselves those enormous multiples. But we're talking about a place that had a lot of large companies for a chunk of the employment, And the norms there is that the CEO wouldn't be paid a lot more than other people because it's just, inappropriate. Now we've changed. One of the reasons that the CEOs get the pay they get is they claim to be entrepreneurs. I'm an entrepreneur, so I get the gains of this company. No, you're not an entrepreneur. You're an administrator and maybe the top administrator, and maybe you get more pay, but you're not the person who took the risk of that company. You may be in the risk of being fired. And so this entrepreneurial ideology plays into, and it's not the sole reason and not the only reason it's happening, but it plays into the justification of really enormous pay. It's I forget, there was some company announced the CEO of a large company that had been around for 80 years was getting $100 million paycheck, and I wanted to write the company and said I would do it for 99 million, and they save $1 million. It's just it's something we have to think about. How is it justifiable that somebody pay themselves enormous amounts on a company that's very much part of a large community and it takes thousands of souls to make working? And I think it's this entrepreneurial ideology, this idea, well, they're the risk taker, they're at the front, they're the entrepreneur, they get whatever rewards they deserve. And so it's an interesting new way we look at the world.
So, but when this new idea is really percolating down to the people, isn't it that a lot of thinking has happened wherein we are propagating this thought? We are not really giving the alternate view. In fact, we have celebrated ideas like the creative class,
Right.
that, oh, you are going to be independent workers, you have so much of talent, you have so much of knowledge, and why don't you just go ahead and really do something around it?
Right.
So how do you really look at that? Because I think
Thank
what
you.
has happened is we have started celebrating something which is hugely different.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I call it the new malthus. There was a depressing economist back in the turn of the 18th to 19th century who made the argument that rich people were rich because they could control themselves. Basically, they were morally right. They didn't have lots of children, and the poor, which couldn't control themselves and had lots of kids, had to spread their wealth among many, many people, and hence were on average poorer. But it was because their own fault. It was their moral and actions failings that made them poor. It wasn't, poverty. Poverty in the Middle Ages was thought to be an affliction from on high, from heaven, and so you gave some 10% of your income to charity because it's not their fault they're poor. This is, but what Malthus redefined is, look, it's the poor's fault for being poor. And that's seen as old fashioned now, and cruel. But the truth is, this entrepreneurial ideology says the same thing. What we are arguing is that if you're wealthy, well, I'm wealthy because I took a risk, I worked hard, so I get this money, and I deserve it because of who I am and my work. But the people who aren't well off, well, that's their own fault. They did not take a risk. They didn't start a company. They didn't take enough entrepreneurship classes and figure out what they needed to do. And, so it's their fault. What we add now, and this is a fascinating thing, is we tell the people who have not made it is to not worry because a string of past failures is part of entrepreneurship. So all they have to do is keep trying, maybe take some more classes, and then they will make it. Of course, that's not true. But what happens is this ideology, which is what I call a new malthus, it calms society down. It takes people out of this. People don't go in the streets. They think, I'm not being punished or disadvantaged by wealthy people. I want to join them. I just have to keep trying.
And
I have to
Bob,
find the next disruption. Yeah.
yeah, but Bob, aren't we also as academics part of the problem out here? Because for a simple reason, uh,
Almost certainly, but go ahead.
yeah, but you quote in your paper as well, and I think there is clear evidence. Like there were some X number of talks that were given at Stanford, and then at the Entrepreneurship Center, and most of them were really talking about failure and how failure has to be celebrated, keep on trying, and so on and so forth. Aren't we propagating that thought by ourselves as well?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. I think that we do need to think carefully about what we're teaching sometimes. Number one, the data is becoming clearer that it's not younger but older people that form good companies. There's some terrific work out of MIT on looking at millions of startups to show that it's, by the way, makes sense intuitively as a past investor that it's really older people, more experienced, who form good companies. And the second thing is that the thing that predicts a successful company is a past success. The thing that predicts a failure best is a past failure. So it's sort of weird that we say, look, you need to celebrate failure. You may need to learn from it, but I'll give you a quick thought experiment that illustrates this the best. Let's suppose you are an investor and suppose you have two companies presenting, company CEOs presenting their plans to you. One of the CEOs has in their background two IPOs in the past, and the other one has one IPO and one bankruptcy. Who do you more likely invest in?
Two
Well, it's real
IPOs.
easy. Yeah, the two IPOs for sure. I mean, the failure may not have hurt, but it don't help. And you may have learned something from it, but it's nothing as good as the success. And the point is that entrepreneurs know this, that the worst thing in the world you can have, it's terrible to fail. I mean, I worried about it all the time when I was running a company and did everything to avoid it. It's something that it's very much like flying. You need to be very aware of all the things that can go wrong and do everything you can to land successfully. But you can't just crash the plane and say, "Oh well, that's the way it goes." And that's what the ideology has changed. Sure, failure is part of entrepreneurship. Sure, you need to teach people about how to recover from it and what lessons to draw from it. But to celebrate it, to elevate it as something that ought to happen if you're on a path, is quite different. I think we need to think very carefully. And I remember very much a student coming to me and saying that, and she said, I want to be an entrepreneur. And I said, that's great. What does that mean? What are you going to sell? And she said, sell. I don't want to be a salesperson. I said, well, if you're going to be an entrepreneur, you're going to be selling. That's all you're going to be doing, and she said, well, no, I just, I don't know. And I said, well, go think about what industry you want to be in and come back. And she came back a little while later and said, well, I've thought about it. I want to be in social. I want to do an app in social media. And I said, fine, go get a job at Facebook or Google for 5 years and then come back and learn about the business and then come back and we'll talk. And she said, no, I want you to teach me to be an entrepreneur. And I said, I am. This is a serious business. You have a lot to learn. We don't teach people 2 courses in business law, and then when they graduate undergrad, say they can practice business law. They have a lot of work to do and go to law school and practice otherwise. And I think it's the same thing for entrepreneurship. I think we've made a mistake if we just tell people, I'll teach you how to write a business plan, and then you go out and do it. Hey, you know nothing about the customers, the supplier base, the dynamics of your market. And so I think we need to approach entrepreneurship and certainly entrepreneurship education more seriously, in my view, and more carefully.
So, uh, Bob, like a lot of countries right now are really trying to push this whole idea of entrepreneurship. Of course, the US has done it, and UK has done it. I think it started with Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and you have actually quoted that in your piece as well. And right now, we see across many countries in the world where we're saying, oh, be an entrepreneur, and everybody wants to just get onto that bandwagon. Do you think governments are really missing a point out here? Because if we get to understand this can actually solve a lot of issues or challenges that might actually be forthcoming in the future.
Right. Yeah. I think these are on average misguided. I mean, there's some good efforts. Um, one of the problems with our is that many of these efforts try to copy Silicon Valley, which is, to my view, ineffective because Silicon Valley is an entrepreneurial environment because of the unique market that it's in. It's had a long time developing. For example, VCs were at the end of the development of Silicon Valley, not the beginning. And what happens rarely is do they copy the beginning conditions. They usually start, well, let's create some VCs and some incubators. And then we'll staff the incubators with people that aren't really sure how to start companies in many cases. And frankly, as a it seems ineffective for another reason. What entrepreneurs need more than money and training is large growing markets. If there are markets in which I, as an entrepreneur, can sell stuff, I'm in really good shape. And if the economy is healthy and the markets are growing, then entrepreneurs will have opportunity. But I don't think that it's the entrepreneurs that create the markets. They're entrepreneurs who exploits those markets. So government efforts to create large markets is important. There is absolutely no doubt that one of the reasons Silicon Valley was successful is the huge market created for aerospace computing equipment in the 1960s in the United States. The government of the United States spent, nowadays, almost $1 trillion in today's dollars in developing computers, microchips, things that could fit on rockets and were light. And the government had its own reason for buying those things. But the point is that the expanding and rapidly growing market generated an industry, which we still celebrate, Intel and National Semiconductor and, and much of the computing industry here in Silicon Valley. So to me, what's surprising is that incubators, which produce a very slow rate of, say, 10-year or 5-year success, are seen as a solution. And it lets the government avoid the more difficult problem. How do I correct the imbalances in the economy so that I have, important growing markets that entrepreneurs can flourish in? In other words, I think that if we just give an entrepreneur money, if you give them enough money, after a while, they'll be fine for a while until they run out. But if you give the entrepreneur an expanding market where many, many people are joining and buying stuff, I think you're creating a long-term benefit. So I think that these government efforts are misdirected. There is a lot of research that shows that one of the first things that governments do when they think they're falling behind is set up incubators. It's not clear in the research yet that incubators have a large effect. And I would guess that particularly in places that need economic development, it's inappropriate and probably doesn't work to give money to a few entrepreneurs to make them wealthy and not worry about the expansion of the economy and the expansion of employment opportunities in it. In other words, I
So,
think these efforts are misdirected.
yeah, Bob, but you make a very important point, and that is that how do we create the appropriate demand conditions? Like that's exactly what you were saying.
Yeah.
What do you think? I have to ask you that question. So how do we
Thank you.
create
Well,
those conditions?
yeah. I worked on a council for this, and we thought about this a lot. Number one, private companies tend not to buy advanced technology. They need technologies for things they can sell today. And they need it cheaper and they need inputs and that kind of thing. Generally speaking, it's governments that are the entities that can generate new dynamic markets. Again, I'll go back to the aerospace industry of the 50s and 60s in the United States. That was just almost entirely government spending.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it was for the most advanced technology. It was, nobody else needed or was, as desperately a chip to fit onto a rocket that was light. That was radical technologies. Radical technologies and communications were developed. And it's because the government was buying it. Now, of course, they were supporting big companies too who were making it, but tons of little companies got involved in this. Entrepreneurs saw opportunities. So one route is, I think, as governments, and there's a a push here in the United States for infrastructure, and I think that's good. As governments spend money to improve the country, and that's one place where growing markets come from. The second, of course, you'd have to talk to economists about this, and I'm not an economist, but as tastes change, that changes things. One of the things we tried to do in the council was to just have two parts of Japan have different anyway, something to do with electricity. One's at 50 and the other's at 60. And we just said, let's make them the same. That means that lots of companies would have to go through all the adjustments of the wires and the things in the house and everything else. There'd just be lots of activity.
Hmm.
And so, that would generate. So the vitalness of the opportunity for entrepreneurs comes from the collective actions, and we need to stimulate collective actions. We need to stimulate social work. One friend of mine was arguing with me. I was playing poker 2 nights ago, and he said, "Hey, we're going to get inflation because we're spending all this money on roads and airports." I said, "No, we're getting roads and airports. We're buying stuff,
Hmm.
and that's opportunity for companies large and small." So again, to me, it's the initial push almost certainly comes through. Marianne Mazzucato has written a great deal about this, where the initial push, and particularly in innovation, comes from the governments, and then the economic dynamism created from that. I mean, nobody would have anticipated that at the time people were trying to build integrated circuits and semiconductors for aerospace, that would result in Facebook or Uber.
Yeah,
So we push.
very interesting. But Bob, I have to ask you one more question. You don't touch it in your work, but I want to ask that, and that is,
Yeah,
like it is when you say that this is the age of security is over.
right.
How does aging have an impact on this? Because
Oh,
that's an interesting point, because when you're young you're doing that gig work or whatever, but when you're suddenly beyond 60, 65, and you don't have anything in your
right,
pocket in terms of the social security that used to be there in the past,
right.
then what happens?
Yeah, that changes the world. I mean, that really does. That's very, very important. One of the problems with, or in my view, certainly, because I'm over 60, one of the problems with the entrepreneurial ideology is the celebration of youth, and the not paying attention to the value of expertise and experience. But what happens is, and that's your question, is pretty simple. Um, the people who have done well do very well and they're fine. But there's tons of insecurity in the United States, tons of it. And they're voting for people who promise them security, whether they can deliver it or not. And we saw this happen, I believe, in Japan, when Japan started taking apart its big companies um, and create insecure work conditions. The government changed every couple of years. I mean, it's like they loved government. They had a new one every week. And, it creates political and social instability when people don't have secure jobs that develop communities. It's very important for the economy to support and make possible the security of people who work, not the exceptional people, not the most talented, but the average person who can thrive, develop families, work in communities, send their kids to Little League, send their daughters to college, all that stuff. And that comes from the average person doing well. And we had partial structure of that in the United States, certainly in the 50s and 60s. Just a partial structure, but a structure for it. And most people were secure in their work who worked. But now people are insecure. They don't know that they'll have a job in a year. and that makes them want different governments or different kinds or search for solutions. And we have gotten, well, we've gotten what we deserved, at least in my view, in the United States in the past. And uh, I worry very much that this precarity you speak of, particularly as we dispose of expertise and knowledge, will mean instability politically. And of the major countries in the world, such as India, such as the United States, such as Japan, if they become unstable politically, that does not speak well for the past 70 years of peace continuing. So I worry very much that we've
That,
created a world we're not going to be comfortable with.
that's a grim view. But then, if I might ask, like, what do you think could be the learning for a country like India
No,
or
I think
developing world, if at all, from this?
thanks, and that's right. I think that's one. That's grim view. That's the other way. The other way that's going to go is, I think, maybe terrific, as we could just be looking at a point in time where where we're changing from one type of business to another type, and the other type will grow into large companies again, or more stable companies that employ people. Certainly, Silicon Valley has become a province of large companies. The and if that happens, then I would suspect that the employees or contractors will start demanding better pay, more stability, and we'll have roughly the same thing that we had here in the 20s and 30s, where people demanded we'd be treated better, and we develop a new, more stable environment. I think one of those two worlds is where we're going. And I certainly hope it's the one I just talked about, because my children have to live in it. But we're in a world of change. Change is insecure, and that's kind of the point of the whole paper. It's just a more insecure world.
Yep, absolutely. And but like Bob, we could have continued to talk for hours, but I still have one or two big questions. Like,
Go for it.
what do you think? What more should you think we should read? What are the top three things or three books that you would suggest the audience of this webinar and even the recording at a later point? What do you think they should read?
Oh boy, there are three which jump to mind really quickly. One that has inspired me, certainly, if you're on an academic view of what we're talking about, is Ricard Bendick's work, which was published in the 50s, on work and authority. I think is really, really important to read and understand. I would also go to more popular texts as people read about how the gig economy develops. I think Juliet Shore has published a great one just recently on gig work that's very, very accessible, and how people can understand what gig work means and how it does. My friend at Stanford, Paul Oyer, has produced some interesting stuff on gig work too, from an economics point of view. And then finally, I would go to the classics. This is what made me comfortable when I was running a company. Running a company is no fun, but I always read the Odyssey and the Iliad over and over again, and that just taught me that human problems are old and continuing. And we should not worry about our own small self and small times.
And something that we might not have touched upon. Of course, we have touched upon a lot of things, but something that you would like to add as a last parting point with the audience.
Thank you. Yeah, the last parting point is very, very simple. I think we need to be aware that entrepreneurship has transformed from a commercial activity to a socio-political idea of the way to act and the way to see things. I think we need to think in terms not of the winners. We need to think in terms of the average person, and is our society constructed to produce the most benefit for the most people? I'm not endorsing, any particular political view, at least here. But the point is that we need to change the emphasis from celebrating wealth to celebrating communities and the success of communities. We need to celebrate that this is a wonderful place to live. I want to live here. I want to raise my children here. I want to, pursue my existence here. And if we start thinking about community and less about, individual success, gosh, think that would help us a lot.
Bob, on this note, thanks a lot for such a fascinating interaction and such an insightful interaction. I think I learned so much. And in fact, it would be a privilege for me if I'm able to contribute something to your work because I find this fascinating, insightful, and probably see similar kind of effects in India as to what your paper draws. So would look forward to an opportunity to meeting you once I'm back again in Stanford, once the lockdowns are over and things,
Right.
and look forward to being in touch. Thanks a lot, and it's
We
an honor to
welcome
have you
you
with
or
us.
anyone else to the project. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you.
I hope everyone did well, and feel free to contact me.
Thank you. Bye bye. Bob, be
Bye
well
bye.
and be safe.
You too. Bye bye.